Welcome, everyone. I'm Erik Brynjolfsson, and this is the Stanford Digital Economy Lab lunch seminar. I'm glad you could join us today. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker today, Xavier Gabaix. He's a professor of finance and economics at Harvard University. Before that, he was at MIT and NYU. He has a long list of awards, which I won't take up the time to read, but I just will mention that The Economist recognized him as one of the top 8 young economists in the world. And he's been doing some fascinating work on power laws and economics. So I'm going to hand it over to you now, Xavier. Take it away. Thank you.
Okay, great. So let me share slides. So hello. So feel free to interrupt or answer, ask questions in the Q&A, and Erik will look at them. I won't be able to look at them, but Erik will have a bandwidth to do that. So I'm going to talk about power laws. I explain what those things are and to what extent they matter for the digital economy. And so first, I'll show you lots of facts. I think it's kind of fun to see how they pop up everywhere. And it will look like a bit like botany, or those things are everywhere. But then we'll talk about explanations. There will be two types of explanations. One is random growth. So if your firm, you grow and shrink with some stochastic random growth rate every year. And what happens in the steady state, you're going to get some power law, basically. A very different, superficially type of explanation is economics of superstars. So basically, if you're a talented person or you have a talented maybe piece of software, a useful piece of software, if somehow you can improve a productivity either of the whole economy or a substantial subpart of the economy, like a firm, then you're going to get potentially very, very large rewards, maybe huge stock options, a huge salary, and we'll have actually a very mathematically precise and quantitative way to think about those things. And then throughout the talk, I'll talk about like implications, as I can speculate, for the digital economies. And then we leave lots of time for the Q&A at the end. But maybe it's better that you intervene in real time if there's some point that's clear or unclear or tempting, or you'd like me to elaborate on. Okay, so let's start with just some facts. Okay, so what's a power law anyway? So one of the oldest is something called the Zipf's law, and Zipf was actually a Harvard linguist. I explained the link. And so what's that? So this is I follow what Krugman did before he became a high-level polemicist. So, okay, so you take all the cities in the US, or all the large cities in the US, in the statistical abstract, and you just rank them by size. Very simple. And so you have a top city in the US here, that will be New York, and you here you write the this is log of the population of New York and log of a rank being 1, the log of a rank is 0. Likewise, the next one will be Los Angeles, I suppose, and you put the log population of Los Angeles, log rank as log 2, and you do that for all the cities in the US, or the large cities at least, and you find that it falls, well, it's declining, there's a tautology, but it falls pretty much on the straight line that's not a tautology. And when you look at the slope of that graph, log rank versus log size, you find a slope that's around 1. And here it turns out to be 1.005, okay? And a power law, it's saying when you do a log size, log rank graph, you're going to find a straight line, okay? And a Zipf's law is a particular type of power law where the exponent is 1, or close to 1, okay? But where the R square is 0.98, which is pretty nice in economics when you have 0.9 square. 98 R squares. And so part of what's fun about, for instance, the Zipf's law for cities is that you go to the US in 1900 or 1800, that's where Zipf actually did, you find the same thing. You look at the distribution of words. So some words are very popular, like the, or a, of, that sort of thing. And some words like popular are not that popular, they're kind of rare. And you look at the size would be the frequency in a given text, say on Wikipedia, for instance, or in the Bible. And you find also a power law for the log rank, log frequency of a word with an exponent actually close to 1. Okay. And so part of the joys of thinking about power laws is collecting facts like that, and then why do they happen? Okay, and first I'll show you some facts, and then we'll talk about the why. Okay, and I think we understand, for a number of them, we understand fairly well what the why, and some we don't actually. So it's still active.
Xavier, we have a question, if you don't mind. I think it's okay to interrupt, right?
Oh, great,
Go back to the chart. Really fascinating line. It appears to fit better down the lower side, and the question is, it doesn't seem to fit quite as well at the very top. Do you have a story of why this is happening? Or when I say top, I mean at the upper tail. Yeah.
Extreme cities. That's just basically statistical noise, if you want. There could be some very interesting economic deviations, but it turns out it's consistent with a null, or it's just some statistical noise. Because, okay, so that's a great segue to the next slide. What can you expect? Really, you can expect not log rank, log size should fit exactly on top of each other. All the economic models I'm going to talk about will be of a type. Look, it's a probabilistic law. So it's God made the world in such a way. We'll see it's actually evolution that made the world in such a way, like often, that the size distribution of the probability that a randomly chosen city had a size bigger than S will be proportional to S to some minus zeta, where zeta like zip. Zeta is the Greek z. Zeta is this power law exponent. Okay, so the best you can expect is that in some average sense, the log rank, log size will hold, and it turns out it should hold with very little standard error over there, and should hold only with very large standard errors over there. So that's part of why you see those.
It could just be random. Just any given point is going to move around randomly, and the bigger ones just have a bigger.
That's right.
Exactly. And it doesn't preclude that at some point one city can become bigger than another city. I'm old enough to remember when Chicago was the second biggest city.
That's right. Exactly. So it could be that if Chicago has a big fiscal crisis with riots and whatnot, boom, Chicago will go down the distribution. So surely something like that happened to Detroit, for instance, and there's there's randomness. If San Francisco has more sensible housing policy, boom, the size of San Francisco will increase. Anyway, absolutely. And so that's so in those slides, in case. I had some derivations, but I will not talk about them. So that's so really it's a probabilistic law that has a rank size interpretation on average, but it's the probabilistic law that matters. I show some graph in densities.
Okay,
so
just two other quick questions,
sure.
If it's okay, and feel free to say.
Yeah, go ahead. Always okay.
John Cochran asks, are these cities or SMSAs? What is the definition of a city?
Right. So those are SMSAs it's really agglomerations, okay, for those who don't know the lingo. So the city of New York, includes probably Jersey City and little cities around that. Likewise, San Francisco includes some, probably Palo Alto, I'm not exactly sure, but the cities around, the agglomeration of San Francisco includes the little cities around that. Okay, so it's the properly economically meaningful thing, not the legal entity. Okay.
And then a second question, which well, you sort of already answered this, but it's worth underscoring. William Reinhardt asked, for the Zis graphs, you say it's not a tautology. Can you expound on that? Because a high R squared, such a high R squared usually means that we are capturing an accounting identity, like a tautology.
Yes. So no. So the tautology, it should be monotonic. But then if you ask, can I draw a monotonic curve with an R square of almost zero? The answer is yes, you can. You can.
Yeah, so by definition, it has to be downward sloping, but it doesn't, you could have, in theory, have a different exponent, and so that's actually what makes it so remarkable, as you're saying, that it just turns out this way.
That's right. So it was remarkable as two things. One is that it's a pretty large R square. So that's, again, not a tautology. The R square could be 0.1, even with the monotonicity. And even more remarkable, it's the exponent very close to 1. Okay. So I show, sometimes you do it in density. So in cumulative, it's 1 over x to the zeta. density is going to be 1 over x with zeta plus 1. So the slope will be, the Zipf's law, the slope would be 2 in density and 1 in log rank, log size. Okay. Why are those things? Why do you see those things everywhere? In part because they have a claim to be universal. So physicists love talking about universality, and economists rarely, but here I think it's kind of universal. For instance, just to start from that, it's unit invariant. So whether you measure the population in number of inhabitants or thousands of inhabitants, the zeta will be the same, or the k here will be different. Also, if you have a power law, if x follows a power law, b times x or b times x to some alpha will also follow power law with an exponent, what would be here, zeta to be alpha. Okay. And also for later, I'll talk a bit about inequality. If you have if it's very unequal at the top, it means 1 over zeta is very high. So zeta is very low, close to that Zipf's law. Okay. And if likewise, if you take 2 power laws and you take their sum, it's still a power law. Their product, it's still a power law. Exponentiation of the mean and the max is still a power law. So that's part of why you can see them in lots of domains of economics. Because even if you have a simple mechanism that generates a power law, any kind of friction around it, like adding noise to it, will still preserve a power lawness with actually the same exponent. It's part of why you can do clean empirics and clean theory on those things. Okay, if you that was John Cochrana's question. If you build cities from a bottom up, so this is from a geographical little cells, where you see in this little 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer how many people are there, and you build the city from the bottom up without any kind of prior knowledge about legal boundaries, you find also beautiful Zipf's law starting at cities of around 500 inhabitants. So it's actually the Zipf's law is not just for the top, but like, well, basically all cities starting.
I'm not understanding what you mean by building from the bottom up. You have a 1 square kilometer. Is it how many people are in that? Or
exactly. So you look at how many people you have grids like that, and you can say within you put a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer grid on the US, and you look at the number of people in each grid. For some of them, it's 0.
Okay. So basically, how dense each grid is.
Exactly, and then you can say if it's like connected, if it's connected. Completely populated, then this is, and you do the maximally connected set, then it's a city. And then let's say it's completely empty around that, or it's some very, very low density, then you say that's the end of a city, just empty space around that. And there's an extra city later, maybe that would be Los Angeles, for instance. Then you get
where you turn that perimeter, you could have the whole East Coast be one big megalopolis.
That's right. So you want to have a sensible, quote unquote, parameter. Here, actually, for that simplest of graphs, the criterion is 0. So you stop the city when there's exactly 0 people but you could fine tune that, but you don't need to fine tune it, it turns out. Anyway,
it's more interesting if you don't fine tune it, I guess. I mean, it's interesting if it works for lots of different parameters, I guess.
That's right, exactly. So you really don't, exactly. So it's absolutely quite robust. So now maybe people don't care about cities, but almost all economists care about firms. And so this is a famous paper by somebody called Axtell in Science magazine, so a hugely cited paper. And he looks at all the firms in the US census, not like the firms in CompuStat or the firm in the stock market or some very partial data set, but all the firms in the US, including the little restaurants and barbershops and whatnot. And here, again, log size, log frequency, and the slope you find is again the Zipf with a size exponent of 1.05, as it turns out, okay? With an exponent of 0.99. So again, great success for that regularity. Okay, a bit closer to other things, popularity of internet sites. It also follows the Zipf's law. Those are old but super well-cited papers. Number of clicks, for instance, per day or something like that. And now, once you have a power law for something, there should be power law for other things. If you have a Zipf's law for the size of firms, there should be also Zipf's law for the size of exports, because large firms will export. Likewise, Zipf's law for the losses in bankruptcy. And then if you want to talk about the value at risk in the economy, that's important to know. Number of workers in strikes. And there are lots of papers documenting now those things. Likewise, there's a Zipf's law for the assets under management, size of mutual funds. Anyway, so given you find those regularities everywhere, it's useful to think about mechanisms. I'm going to talk about that soon. Let me not talk about this one. Let me show about the stock market. So there's at least one finance person here. This is the size distribution of stock market returns. You do something very simple. You lump all the stocks together, or maybe here those are all the large stocks and all the small stocks, or you standardize by the standard deviation of each stock. So they have standard deviation of 1. And you ask what's the number of, what's the frequency of returns with more than here 1 standard deviation, or 2 standard deviations, 3 standard deviations, 4 standard deviations, and then you add what's the frequency of returns with 10 standard deviations, okay, and then 20 standard deviations, 30 standard deviations, up to 100 standard deviations, and you see a power law, and you say, come on, we can't observe any 20 standard deviation events, but you can. So think about it. For a typical stock, the typical return might have a size of 1% a day. Okay, so what's a 20 standard deviation event? It's 20% a day, and almost every day, there's at least one stock that has a 20% plus or minus return. So, at least intuitively,
that doesn't sound like a normal distribution.
So exactly, a power law with a normal distribution that will happen with probably 10 to the minus 200 or something.
Right.
So we're very far from that. But more interestingly, it seems like a universal exponent, and the exponent is more around 3. So it means the variance is finite, by the way. So that's reassuring. But it's still lots of fat tail. And by the way, for any stock, you can see if you remove the top few events in a year, that changes totally the ex-post return of the stock. I mean, it's very fat tail. And why is that?
But a lot of finance is based on assumptions of normal distributions, right? Well,
it turns out, strictly speaking, not really. So it's more as a convenience. You do a Gaussian distribution. You assume a Gaussian because you can get lots of closed forms and all that. But in fairness, not that much. It's not that central actually.
So long-term capital management knew about this chart.
No, had they known, well, there's been lots of research since long-term capital management and their crash. And yeah, had they known a number of things like that, they would have surely had different policies. We don't completely understand why. I mean, I have actually 2 papers proposing explanation. It's not really clear. We know why. Distribution of volume, by the way, is an exponent of 1.5, as it turns out. And in that theory, we say very large institutions, they have follow ZIP, mutual funds, they follow Zipf's law with an exponent of 1. They trade kind of slowly, so the volume is a little less fat tail with an exponent of 1.5. And there's a square root price impact, so that the law of 1.5 for volume is to an exponent of 3 for returns. But in fairness, it's still quite speculative, unlike a number of other things I'm going to talk about. So anyway, okay, this is cool. So let me just spend some time on it. So if you look in nature, you have lots of power laws. So if you ask, this is as a function of the mass of the animal, what's the metabolic rate, which is the amount of calories you need to feed the animal, let's say a mouse or an elephant, so that they function normally, okay? And you might think maybe God or nature should make the world constant return to scale. So if an elephant is 1 million times bigger than a mouse, it should consume 1 million times more energy, food. But it turns out, no, it's not proportional to the mass. It's proportional to the mass to the 3/4. And for a century, people have wondered why. And there's a team of physicists and biologists who have, to my mind, a very convincing explanation. If you build an optimal elephant or mouse or goose or man and woman, by the way, at the optimum, you have a parallel distributed vascular system for the blood, and you want to minimize the amount of energy lost in the system. So you want to minimize the surface, the area in the blood vascular system, and you're going to generate that and lots of other things, by the way. Anyway, okay. Let me not talk about how there are 2 ways to estimate power laws. Let me not talk about that. Let's say it's not general interest. But well, now, why do they come? Why do they come about? Well, 2 main reasons. One is random growth, and the other one will be economics of superstars, like asymptotic matching. So let me talk about briefly the first one. So it was, I think, established by an economist called Champollion And so I show you the simplest version, and it admits very lots of variance and enrichments in that. So the simplest version is the following. Suppose you look at the size of a firm, SIT, think the sales of a firm, okay? And you say, look, because of random growth in productivity or popularity of its products or whatnot, the size of what happens to the competition too, the size of a firm at time t plus 1 is the size of a firm at time t times some multiplicative random growth. So let's say maybe you grow or shrink with plus or minus 10%. It means the standard deviation of that growth factor will be 10%. And maybe you have a mean growth rate of 2%, or maybe, depending on what you have. Or maybe it's a fraction of the economy, then you might have a mean growth rate of minus 0%, minus 0.1% or something. Okay, and then Champollion asks, if you have this system and you just let it run, what happens? So first, if you don't put any friction, it's totally degenerates, because the log size at time t plus 1 and the log size at time t plus some noise, and the variance goes to infinity and there's no steady state. So you need to add a little bit of friction. And here it's going to be, there's a minimum size. If you have a minimum size, either you disappear and you replace by a fresh new firm, or you grow a little faster if you're too small, or maybe there's an additive factor to that equation, okay? But now, once there is a stabilizing force, a little friction, then there is a steady state distribution, and it's actually a power law. And then I will not talk about the math, for it's kind of pretty. You look at the equation of motion for the whole distribution of a system, and you say you can show there's a power law in the limit, and the power law follows a pretty equation, which is the following: it's zeta, the exponent of a power law, will be the unique strictly positive value that satisfies this equation. So I like to call it Champollion equation, okay, where gamma tilde is the random growth process. So for instance, suppose your random growth process is you grow on average at μ% a year, and you have also standard deviation, idiosyncratic standard deviation of σ% a year. Then you can solve for that, and the exponent will be this exponent over there. So it turns out that, so how to think about it? If you grow faster, mu is higher, then, so if large firms grow faster, mu is higher, so zeta will be lower, which means it's going to be more unequal at the top. It makes sense. If large firms grow faster, there should be more, it's easier to be a super large firm, and so there will be more inequality at the top.
Right.
Now, there's a subtlety if you look at the sigma term, which is actually to think about the system. Suppose ST is the share of your sales divided by total GDP, so that it's normalized. Then, or your total fraction of SIT is your fraction of the total employment pool you have. Then the mu should be strictly negative, and that's because there's only this amount of people in the economy, and so on average it cannot be that all firms the number of employees grow at 2%. It should be 0 or slightly negative if there's entry and exit. Okay, and so typically the mu has to be negative if you're in a fraction of the total GDP or fraction in total number of employees.
Why isn't it 0 in steady state? Why is it negative?
That's because there's also that's the simplest version. In this, you will always have also some entry and exit, and just to have entry, it means there are some small firms that have a higher growth rate than the rest of the economy because they grow from nothing, and right. So that's why for the very large firms you need a negative growth rate. In part, that's an accounting identity.
If it averages to 0, then yeah, and some are positive, then some must be negative.
That's right. It's exactly that. Okay, and so that's what and so then you get the reassuring comparative static. If sigma is higher, there's more volatility, then there's more inequality at the top, as it makes sense. If mu is negative. Anyway, now let me not And so you might ask now, why is there Zipf's law? Okay, so first for incomes and wealth, the zeta is around 1.5 for wealth, maybe 2.5 for income. Okay, but it's not total 1, and it's 1 for firms and cities. And why is that the case? So that was actually my first paper ever. And it's a very simple observation once you approach the problem the right way, which is, look, if, for cities or firms, there's the total amount of employees that you need to allocate across all the firms. Now, suppose that, so the average size, SIT is the relative size of all of each firm as a fraction of total employees it has. The total sum of relative sizes needs to be 1. And suppose now this Champollion random growth process holds for almost everywhere in the economy, not just at the top, but almost everywhere. Then, if it holds almost everywhere, and if you have that, then it must be the case that the expected value of gamma is 1. That's because this way the average normalized firm size remains, say, 1/n. And then it means the solution to the Champollion equation is 1. And so that's why you get the Zipf's law. So, so that's the argument if you need to make it fit on 1 page. Another way to put it is you say, look, there is random growth of size of firms, and then there's a minimum amount of size of firms. Let's call it S min. And if you're below the minimum, then you disappear and you're replaced by a fresh size of firms. Then there's always a power law, and the exponent is that. And then as the friction, like the minimum size of a firm becomes really small compared to the average size of firms, and as the friction becomes close to 0, then the power law is not any power law, but it's the Zipf's law with an exponent of 1. So that's what it comes about. Okay.
And conversely, if the friction got bigger, then you get a power law with a bigger exponent.
That's right, exactly. And why do wealth and income? Why is there an exponent of 1.5, 2.5? Basically, that's because people die. So that's the big friction that prevents the random growth. And if one day we had the singularity and we stop dying, then amongst other interesting things, there will be a higher, more inequality at the top. Anyway.
And so those are some particular interesting examples. Can you describe a situation where we've seen that friction grow or shrink over time and a corresponding change in the parameter?
Say for the size of cities and firms, for all the data I know, it's actually quite at Zipf actually, except actually China under Mao. Then it's actually not. It was much more equal. And maybe it was he didn't like big cities. People need to learn life on the countryside. But otherwise, it's quite.
But aside from city, I mean, is there a place where we've seen power laws where you could observe the friction kind of growing or shrinking, or plausibly, and do we see a change in the parameter?
It's a great question. Not that I know. What we have seen is that equation. So when people look at the distribution of income or wealth, first it's at the top fairly well described by power law. Yeah. And there's a paper by Jones and Kim. We'll talk about with the students later in the JPE, and it tries to track what is the mu, the growth rate if you're a large firm or large talented person.
Well, you imagine that different societies, different tax systems, different regulatory regimes might have different frictions for different income.
That's right. So there's a number of cross-sectional papers saying here's the Pareto exponent for different countries, with a tax rate or things like that. For me, it's all very non-identified. It could be that if there's lots of rich people to tax, you can tax them more, or maybe they have too much power and you cannot tax them more. It's a little, So I don't know of any good causal evidence, like this Jones-Kim paper being one. Maximally heroic attempt at trying to get mean growth rates for large incomes, for instance, but it's just hard to. The data is not easily available. Erik told me he has access to IRS data, so maybe with that we'll know. So, okay, let me. Now, why do we care? In part because first we ought to know, and then when there's a regularity like that in economics, you'd like to know where it comes from, and then you can think about policy, welfare, looking at the micro parameters, and that's just important to know. And also, if you see the Zipf's law for firms, you might say, oh, it's due to antitrust or power or transaction cost. But no, look, if it's universal across different economic systems, and it cannot depend on the details of the externalities or for cities. It should not depend on the details of the congestion externalities and pollution and positive externalities, the ideas and all that. It should be much more universal, a bit like the metabolism of the elephant and the mouse as a function of size. Anyway, so I think it forces you to think about the essence of what's going on as opposed to lots of little accidents. Anyway, now let me talk about the second way, I think, to generate power laws, which is economics of superstars. So the big site for that is Rosen. There's a paper by an economist called Sherwood Rosen called The Economics of Superstars. It was very prescient, but it's very qualitative. And so a more quantitative version of that. Sorry?
1981, right?
1981, I think that's right, exactly. A more quantitative paper is this paper written with Augustin Landier. And the title is Why Has CO pay increased so much? But you will see if I wrote why have the pay of divorce lawyers or top surgeons or top programmers increased so much, it would be the same, the exact same economics. But here I'll say CO just for concreteness. So what's the economy? Imagine, so basically you're rewarded for talent, okay? But how? So imagine you have N firms and N CEOs, and people who won't be CEOs, maybe number 5 in the firm, and now each firm, you have your firm I, you have a size SI. So think SI is your profits, okay, or maybe your productivity or some measure like that, okay. And if you hire a CEO for 1 year of talent T, what this CEO does for you, let's say she increases your profits by SI times T%. Let's say this C is 1, it doesn't matter for us here. Okay, so a CEO of talent T is very operational. You hire this CEO for 1 year. The CEO will increase your profits by SI times T% on average. Okay, and so what's your object? What should be your objective function for you, the firm? You want to hire a really good CEO. Okay, except those people cost money, and so there will be an equilibrium market price for a CEO of talent T. Okay, likewise, programmer of talent T, neurosurgeon of talent T, etc. Okay, okay. So now, what will be the economic equilibrium? Let's start qualitative first.
A key assumption here is that a CEO will increase profits proportional to the size of the firm. If a CEO is a little bit better than if they're working in a bigger firm, they'll have a bigger impact than in a smaller firm.
That's right. That's exactly that. Yeah. Okay. So really simple premise. You could imagine not proportional to the size of the firm, but the size of the firm to some exponent, gamma, maybe less than 1 or more than 1. But it turns out in calibration, then you just replace the definition of what size is. Okay. So first qualitatively, so those are called assortative matching equilibria. They're efficient. Okay. And you're going to have the largest firm the largest firm is going to hire the best CEO in the economy, the second largest firm, the second best CEO, the third largest firm, the third best CEO, and all the way down. Okay. And here I'm going to imagine a continuum of firm and a continuum of CEOs. So it's completely competitive, though in words I'm sometimes going to say largest firm, second largest firm. Okay. Okay. And then you work out the equilibrium. And then after 5 pages of consideration that I'm sparing you here, you have, that will be the equation for the equilibrium pay. So if I'm a CEO of hired by firm I, if firm I is a large firm, I have a high talent, but I'm paid my market price of talent, so very pro-market competitive equilibrium. And you're going to have 3 predictions. So the pay of CEO at firm I will be higher if it's in a large firm. That's really because that's a talented CEO. And I will calibrate this rho to be 1/3 empirically. And nobody has a good theory of why it's 1/3, but let's say we have a theory for why it's between 0 and 1. Okay, so large firms will have better CEOs and they will be paid more. But also what matters is not just my firm, but also the average firm, the average large firm in the economy. Because what matters for me is not the firm that employs me, but all the outside offers I might get. So the average size, S star is the average size of firms, of large firms in the economy. And so if the average size of large firms in the economy is very large, on average, they would like to bid up for my talents, and my market price of talents will be higher. Okay. And so it makes 3 predictions. In the cross section, regressing your log pay on your log size, you should have exponents between 0 and 1, let's say 1/3. But in the time series, if the size of all firms is multiplied by 6, that will be the calibration I'm going to show you, then the pay of all top CEOs will be also multiplied by 6. And that's because basically if the size of all large firms have been multiplied by 6, then talent is 6 times more valuable. You can see that right there in this equation. And as a result, you should be paid 6 times more. Okay. And it turns out it works pretty well in the data. I'll just show you one graph. So you run, like always in Parlo, log wage or log something on log something, log wage on log your own firm size versus the log average firm size in the economy, and here's in market cap anyway. And so if it's rho is 1/3, you should find an exponent of 1/3 on your own pay and 2/3 on the average size. And this is exactly what you find. So you regress log pay, you find roughly 1/3 on your own firm size, but roughly 2/3 on the average size of the economy, consistent with this market equilibrium with kind of aggregate constant return to scale. In particular, that means that why has CEO pay increased so much is just that the large firms have increased a lot in size. And then we can talk about why, but let's look at that. So you can do total firm value, that's debt plus equity, that's the red curve. So since 1980, the total size increase has been around 4.5, or equity value, it's been more a factor of 6. Okay. And if you look at compensation, it's been roughly the same depending on which compensation index you take. Okay, and also some of the wiggles. So in 1999 you have a tech boom, and so firm sizes become bigger, and pay of CEOs become bigger, and then after 5 years a big crash, a stock market crash, and then so it's less valuable to have very high paid people, very high talent people. So the aggregate market wage falls, and then 2008 it falls again, and then rises later. Anyway, so it fits actually quite well.
So a couple of questions that Xavier. John Cochran has a question. There must be an assumption here about a fixed supply of people with talent. If there's a flat supply curve, then wages would be unchanged.
That's right. So here there's a big assumption, which is in some short to medium run, exactly fixed supply. Now, of course, like all supply curves, in the longer run, it should be more fixed, more flexible. And we can think it's a really interesting topic. Later we'll talk to the grad students. Why is the talent, why is that so consistent with fixed supply? First, of talent. First, so in part, it could be that just really hard to accumulate this talent. So if you want to be a top investment banker, typically you need to be groomed by other top investment bankers, and you do their spreadsheets for them for like a slave for 5 years, but you accumulate the useful human capital, but you cannot really learn that on the web or something like that. Likewise, doing a PhD is very much like an apprenticeship where so there's it could be one of the constraints of a supply of talents. Lots of people, anyway, so or maybe it could be that the model, there was an increase in supply of talent that's important, but and the model would fit even better this way. We just didn't have data on the supply of talent. That's why we can imagine it was fixed. but it would be nice to know more about that exactly.
But back on that, so the top 500 equity, the yellow dot, what is that?
So you look at the either average or median, I don't remember, market cap amongst the top 500 firms.
Okay, gotcha.
And you could do firm value, which is market cap plus debt, which is in some, for many things, the better measure of a firm size. Let me mention, when you calibrate the model, this is, so if nobody, so for the students here and the people, do pay attention to that. This really may change your mind. So it may help you focus your mind for a long time. So this is the calibration of a model. Everything is calibrated. It turns out that the talent distribution you want to fit for CEOs has a maximum. And by the way, it's not the true talent, it's the expected talent given observables. Anyway, and so it's a bit like, sprinters and all that. There's a physiological maximum at any given point in time, and it's not like unbounded, okay? But in this economy, you get that mathematical relationship, which means, look, it's the economics of superstars in action. If you're a little more talented than the rest, you get, your pay is 5 times bigger, and you're a little more talented again, your pay is 10 times bigger. And if you're a little more talented, as you go to a T-max, your pay gets unboundedly large. Okay, so to put it simply, Tim Cook, he may not like super more talented than the median CEO in the S&P 500, but given the market cap of Apple is, let's say, $1 trillion, if Tim Cook can increase the market cap of Apple by 0.1% more compared to the median CEO in the economy, how much is that worth to Apple? Well, it's worth $1 billion every year. So that's why a small difference in talent has an unboundedly large impact on your wage. So for the students,
but that's assuming that the firm size is unbounded, right? I mean,
that's right. And that's because at least at the level of idealization of this model, the firm size is unbounded. Exactly. I mean, think people's normal wages like a few $100,000 or millions of dollars, but the firm size is like $1 trillion. So in terms of a scale, it's still I'm a little loose, but you can, you're exactly right. You can make that more precise. Okay. So anyway, so when you're tired and you feel like slacking off a little bit, think again that a little bit higher talent, okay, won't give rise to enormous rewards in this work. And you can see that for anything, for lots of other things, say top, brain surgeons. Why they pay millions of dollars, those people? And why is that? Well, in part is because if you're a very rich person, you're a billionaire, if a top brain surgeon increases your probability of surviving by 5 extra percent, it's worth 5% to you times the billions of your wealth. So there will be an enormous amount of competition for those kinds of talent. Same thing for top programmers. If you make the program run faster or better and or save even electricity on that, Zoom is going to is enormously valuable to the firm. Anyway, and so you be paid a lot.
Any kind of a productivity contribution or a talent contribution that is proportional to the entity that it's working with.
That's right.
There are other places where you may, if you are, I don't know, sweeping an office, it isn't necessarily proportional to how big the company is.
That's right. Exactly. So no, exactly. So what's key here is that if you have this top CEO, his talentee is going to she's going to increase the total firm value, firm profit, or the present value of firm profit by 10% times the firm size. Whereas the people, so now let's look at the person number 10 at Microsoft. So maybe, I don't know what this person does, but maybe he's in charge of Microsoft Asia. I don't know. So then the same model would apply, but instead of being the full of Microsoft, it just Microsoft Asia, or it would be Microsoft, cloud services, and that's some fraction of Microsoft. But this person is managing a small sub-firm of Microsoft. But if you just sweep the floor, what you improve is just your little floor. And so it's not a big, it's not a very big, it doesn't scale up. Scale up very
well. And some don't. Just to do a quick time check, it's about 12:40. So we have about another 12, 13 minutes. There are a few questions in the queue. I can go to those, but I'm going to give you a chance to wrap up a bit, and then we can have there's some questions.
Yeah, let me just wrap up a bit, and then I'll do some questions. So just some, let me not even talk about that. So just wrapping up a little bit. Okay. So you have those power laws everywhere. What are the key mechanisms? You have first is having the random growth, creating this large firm size distribution, CD size distribution, etc. Then you get associative matching and Rosen. So if your talent improves the total productivity of a big entity that has this power law distribution, then it's enormously valuable to the economy, even though you're only slightly more talented than the next person. And then more generally, power laws beget power laws. So once you have power distribution of firms, you have power distribution of exports. Something else, maybe that's, why do you care? I mean, why do you care? I think understanding the mechanisms is useful, at least for me. Understanding how the CEO market, the high talent market, saying it's very consistent with a aggressively rational Chicago-style free market competition. It's kind of interesting to know. Okay, it doesn't mean you should not. You could tax and all that, but it's still good to know it's not about grabbing rents and the like. Also, you can think, why the large concentration in the IT sector or in the banking sector and all that is not necessarily because you have barriers to entry. It's just always the economy, because of these random growth processes, generates very fat tail distribution at the top, and so the top few entities have a big share of the action. Let me say one thing. Also, just for the productivity people over there. There's one extra consequence that's useful, is that if you think about the fluctuations in the aggregate economy, those things matter too. So why is that? I call that the granular origins of aggregate fluctuations, because then TFP shock, productivity shock to Nokia, Microsoft, Walmart, etc., Apple, will materially affect aggregate US productivity. Okay, and those actually are kind of important, and also aggregate US exports. Just a few facts. So in Japan, the top 10 firms is 35% of the exports. In Korea, the top 2 firms is 35% of the exports and 22% of GDP. So the shocks to those like superstar firms, they actually materially affect the aggregate economy. So you want to be nice. I mean, nice. You want to make sure those large firms behave well. You don't want to regulate them super harshly, I think. You want to preserve competition. That's super important. But you don't want to particularly punish them. They drive a lot of the growth. And more for the economists, you can use the recent work with Ralph Koijen. You can use those idiosyncratic shocks to large firms as primitive instruments in the system and see how they affect everything else in the economy. And this way, you can do lots of identification. So that's potentially useful. Anyway, so let me stop there on the and take the Q&A. Thank you, Erik.
Well, great. So that was terrific. John Cochran has a question. Again, your CEOs are being paid much less than their marginal product. Is that right? Or how do you map this between, you talk about incentives and talent in your paper a little bit.
Yeah. They're paid exactly their marginal product in those associative matching, associative equilibrium economics. They paid exactly their marginal product, but it's just a funny definition of what marginal product is. So it's not, so this equation is correct, but it's really how, this CEO, if I replace this CEO by a slightly less good CEO, so you take the first order equation there. You want to see what's the marginal product if you increase the talent by one. If you hire a CEO of slightly higher talent, the marginal product will be basically your firm size, and the marginal amount of extra money you're going to have to pay will be this derivative of the wage with respect to talent, and then the two are exactly equalized. So actually, people are paid their marginal product in this economy.
Explain a little bit about the distinction between incentives and talent. You didn't really mention in the paper, but I mean in the talk, but you go through in the paper a little bit about being paid for talent versus being paid for incentives.
So in this world, you're completely just paid for talent. You're absolutely not paid. There's no issue of incentives. So just it's useful to have this benchmark, okay? And I think it's the case. Basically, CEOs, you give them good incentives on that, enough stock options on that, and then they do the right things. They basically exert the maximum effort.
So paying them more or less doesn't change what they do at all.
Yes and no, in the sense you need to give enough incentives, otherwise they may as well slack off. But my model, subjective model, actually, I have a paper with Alex Edmonds and Landier a bit after this one, where we could try to figure out about that. And we think that the right way to think about it is, let's say there's an effort problem, you need to give them incentives, but basically you give enough incentive to people and then they reach the maximum potential effort. Basically, they do the best they can. And
right.
if Tim Cook stopped sleeping, his productivity was decreased. So he's at the maximum productivity, and that involves taking some, having some fun and some leisure and all that.
Okay.
And then part of your pay will be in incentive form, but that really your total pay will just depend on your productivity. It's just the relative share of how much is fixed pay versus incentive pay that determines the ratio of fixed versus variable pay. The total pay is just your productivity.
Yeah. Okay. Well, related question. John Ellis asked, is this argument for changing the marginal tax rates on income as firm cap and CEO comp rise?
So let me go through the economic logic. So in this world, suppose you taxed all CEOs 50% or even 90%, okay? With exogenous supply of talent, nothing would change. Sorry, the pre-tax compensation would not change, and the post-tax compensation would fall. If you tax them 90%, maybe it would fall by 90%. Okay. And now to analyze what, in the long run, is it a good idea or bad idea? You would need to have a sense of the elasticity of supply of talent, and I don't think we have a good handle on that. And in general, for the impact of taxes, we know the elasticity.
An assumption that the better CEOs are matched to the better firms. I imagine you could just add some noise; it wouldn't really change much or anything.
That's right. So, however, a policy that would be horrible. If you said there's a cap on pay, that would be horrible because that would destroy all the associative matching. If everybody needs to pay maximum $10 million, that would be a big loss to GDP.
And the top firm wouldn't be able to bid for the top CEO anymore.
Exactly.
So there's a question, though. Maybe a lot of people in America have this question. Does the data show that the more talented CEOs actually generate significant higher profitability or a consistent basis?
Not directly. Honestly, not directly. I mean, there are thousands of CEO papers every year, and you can find some papers with positive. And here's the problem: is that if you ask in the calibration of this model, so let's say the contribution of a CEO, even of Tim Cook, okay, so let's say he's paid $1 billion, paid less than that, but okay, which would be 0.1% of the Apple market cap. Okay, the problem is what's 0.1% of the Apple market cap? It's a tenth of the one daily standard deviation of Apple. If Apple has a 1% daily standard deviation of returns. So his pay his marginal contribution would be 0.1% of one daily standard deviation of returns. So it's almost impossible to detect in practice. So that's the key difficulty.
Okay. We're almost out of time, but there's a couple. I'm going to try and bundle a couple of questions together and tie it to an interest of a lot of people here, which is the what's driving this and digitization. So John Cochrane talks about how lots of things have fat tails. He goes through a list. Globalization and maybe technologies allowing things to have more superstars, the internet allowing people to reach people. Neil Thompson focuses on the way that you have a multiplicative production function as opposed to an additive one, and that's what's driving a lot of this. Maybe you can blend those two questions together or answer them separately and link it to what's going on here in terms of driving this.
Oh, no, that's exact. No, those are great points and totally correct. I mean, so here it would be, here the production function of a universal production function in the world is this multiplicative form, exactly. So talent T multiplies SI. But then deep down, there's the whole history of globalization and all that. So why is it that the CEO of of Ford can affect, is paid more, in part because he affects Ford US like he did in 1910, but also affects Ford China and Ford Europe, etc., like you can do now, in part because of IT and globalization and the like. So that's part of how you can have bigger firms, is because the same good idea can now apply not just in Detroit, but also in Shenzhen, or I'm not sure where. Cars are produced in China, lots of places, everywhere in the world. And understanding a little more, the microeconomic determinants of what's going on, what are the types of talents that you can, propagate well around the world versus what's more local, is the kind of thing I think, people do in your lab, Erik, and that's fascinating. And we would like, I would love to know much more about.
Well, likewise. I mean, this has been a fascinating talk, and I really feel regret that it has to come to an end at this point. There are a number of other questions, people pointing some empirical stuff like Alan Kruger's work in rockonomics, and people have some theory questions. I don't know, Ronnie, if there's a way to capture the questions here and share them with Xavier, I think he may find some of them interesting and may be able to answer them offline. But unfortunately, we have finite time here, so we can't have them addressed right now. That was terrific. Oh, one of the first questions, actually, I should mention was if these slides are available, we can make them. If you can share the slides, we can make them available to people, or if we can point them to your papers. Either way.
Sure, sounds great.
Sure. Okay, so we'll put the slides on the website for people to look at. Listen, thank you so much. This has been absolutely spectacular. It's a really important question, more and more important, I think. And I'm glad you're able to explain it so clearly and so vividly. And thank you very much.
Thank you for the great question. It's a great pleasure. And if you find a new regularity in your power law or something, please email me.
I'm sure we will. I know my students are looking at that, and so am I. So we'll all find new ones. We'll share them with you. And let me just say to all of you who joined us today, we had a big group. Next week, we have Robert Frank joining us, who wrote The Winner Take All Society a while back. And he's going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we're seeing that clearly relate to what Xavier just talked about as well. So please join us in 1 week for Robert Frank.
Thanks again. Interestingly, he will say it's all wrong and all unfair and all rigged. This research shows says all totally consistent, perfectly beautiful.
Well, you can join, and if you ask questions of him, I'll be sure to pass them on.
Great.
All right. Great seeing you guys, and thanks again. And yep, see you. Bye.